Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is James Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 10 waiver wire targets for the 2023 fantasy football season. Now, I'll be totally honest. The waiver wire is extremely thin going into Week 10. But there are a couple players at each individual position who have earned our consideration, and I'll talk about these players, giving you guys my thought process and opinions while also presenting statistics in order to justify the reasons as to potentially why you should be picking them up going into Week 10. For those of us who are dealing with upcoming bye weeks, again, there are 4 teams on bye in Week 10. The Kansas City Chiefs, Los Angeles Rams, the Philadelphia Eagles, and Miami Dolphins. Great players across the board. So for those of you who are in need of a player potentially dealing with a bye week or potentially an injury, if your players haven't returned from the injured reserve or have popped up onto the injury report, hopefully these players can help you out not only this week, but for the remainder of the season. Now, considering the thin nature of the waiver wire position currently, I wanted to also go ahead and enter a segment on today's episode in regards to rest of season strength of schedule. In the last 2 live streams that we did on Saturday and Sunday, a lot of you guys were asking me, Andrew, which of these following players would you rather have rest of season? And I went ahead and I looked at these schedules over the course of those live streams in order to try to give you a justification as to which player I prefer based on what they're going to face in the future. So I went ahead and I recalculated the rest of season strength of schedule for all 4 primary positions: running back, wide receiver, tight end, and quarterback. I'll reference that on today's episode. And to close out today's episode, we'll put together a couple pick'em slips via Underdog Fantasy. Now, speaking of Underdog Fantasy, for those of you who want to potentially follow or potentially get my rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season, be sure to travel down to the description and check out the link. When you travel on over, use code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10. Not only are you going to get a first-time deposit match up to $500, you're going to get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning from my email directly to yours. Be sure to check your spam folder. These rankings are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, flex rankings, all-encompassing rankings. So for those of you who are wondering if you're eligible to take advantage of the opportunity of not only playing the pick'ems game, drafting teams, of course, get my rankings, check out the map to the right side of the screen. And if you go ahead and sign up before tonight's game, you can take advantage of the new customer special of Justin Herbert, 0.5 total yards. Again, we'll be putting together a couple pick'em slips at the end of today's episode for those of you who are interested in getting into the action for tonight's game between the Los Angeles Chargers and the New York Jets. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about some of these waiver wire pickups, beginning with the running back position. We'll start with Keaton Mitchell, running back of the Baltimore Ravens. We talked about Keaton Mitchell, I would say a month ago, in regards to picking him up because he was on the injured reserve and soon to return. Unfortunately, in his return, wasn't given much opportunity, and the overall momentum of Gus Edwards over the course of the last 3 weeks has pretty much diverted us from thinking that any other running back would find themselves value within this backfield, especially considering the fact that Gus Edwards has himself, 6 rushing touchdowns in the last 3 games, an unbelievable number. Yet Keaton Mitchell, who is currently only rostered in 4% of Yahoo leagues, 3% of sleeper leagues, has an opportunity going forward to be in a rotation. And that's exactly what John Harbaugh, the head coach of the Baltimore Ravens, said this morning in the press conference. He expects to see a rotation within this backfield. Now, what we did witness yesterday in the Baltimore Ravens game against the Seattle Seahawks, which we all know was a very one-sided event, we did see that in the first quarter, it was all Gus Edwards and Justice Hill. Going into the second quarter and beyond, we did see a lot more Keaton Mitchell. And it wasn't because it was a complete blowout in the first quarter, but rather they started to get more of a rotation going. In the first quarter, 0 rushing attempts for Keaton Mitchell. In the second, 4 attempts for 37 rushing yards. In the third quarter, 3 attempts for 41 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. In the fourth quarter, 2 attempts for 60 rushing yards. An incredible game of over 130 rushing yards. Found himself in the end zone. And he didn't even play that much. He only had 9 rushing attempts, but 19.9 fantasy points. Now, for many of us, this kind of gives us Devon Achane vibes. Now, I don't know if it's going to come to fruition in that overall capacity, but the way that Keaton Mitchell ran against the Seattle Seahawks yesterday was extremely impressive. And going forward, yes, they do have difficult matchups this upcoming week taking on the Cleveland Browns, but there are absolutely reasons why we could justify picking up Keaton Mitchell. First and foremost, it's about Keaton Mitchell becoming the RB2 and not immediately taking over the RB1 role. Against Justice Hill, he absolutely could take over, especially when we take into account that Justice Hill was with the second team offense for the entirety of that entire fourth quarter. In the final couple of drives in which, Tyler Huntley was the starting quarterback, Justice Hill was out there as the primary running back. They didn't get Keaton Mitchell involved there because my assumption is they want to utilize him as a first team running back while Justice Hill can get himself those second team reps. On top of that, throughout the game, yes, Gus Edwards had majority of his overall snaps within the first quarter, but only had 6 total snaps in the second and third quarter. He had 3 in each. Yet he still had himself 2 rushing touchdowns within the overall game. My expectation going forward for Keaton Mitchell is that he'll be the RB2 of this team. And yes, he will still have to compete with Gus Edwards for overall touches. But if he can be extremely efficient like he showed on Sunday against the Seattle Seahawks for the remainder of the season, of course, he's going to continue to be a valuable spot within this offense that continues to blow out teams on a weekly basis. All right, moving on to our number 2 running back, we have Zach Charbonnet. This is a second consecutive game in which Zach Charbonnet outsnapped Kenneth Walker. And for those of you who are thinking, well, Andrew, this was a blowout game, of course they wanted to utilize their second running back. Just so we're all on the same page, they didn't pull out their starters at all on Sunday. Jonnu Smith played 100% of the offensive snaps. They kept the starters in for the entirety of the game, yet they weren't able to find any semblance of success. But when you go ahead and look at the overall distribution of snaps and when exactly Zach Charbonnet is playing, for another consecutive game, Zach Charbonnet dominated 100% of the third down snaps and is obviously getting himself some implementation within the first and second down role. Therefore, the expectation is that Zach Charbonnet, currently rostered in 44% of Yahoo leagues, 53% of sleeper leagues. Again, we mentioned him last week. If he's not already rostered, he is a player that going forward could get himself more opportunities in a positive game script in comparison to what it looked like yesterday taking on the Baltimore Ravens defense. The final player I wanted to mention at the running back position is Antonio Gibson. Antonio Gibson has been an RB1 throughout his career on multiple occasions, but over the course of this season, he has often played the second fiddle behind Brian Robinson Jr. But as of late, he's been able to put up 8 or more fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format in 3 of the last 5 games. In those 3 games, has been able to get himself 4 or more receptions in each of those overall contests. He did experience a season high of rushing attempts and rushing yards on Sunday's game against the New England Patriots. So if in fact there's going to be more momentum for Antonio Gibson going forward, could be a value, certainly a top 36 option if he continues this streak of success within the receiving game, elevating his overall play. All right, let's move on to the wide receiver conversation. Tank Dell must have already been rostered. If in fact you play in a smaller league, maybe an 8 or 6-man league, Tank Dell probably wasn't already rostered considering his overall, contribution in week 8. He was one of my hidden gems in week 8, obviously didn't deliver. I think I was just 1 week behind considering he had himself a monster game yesterday of over 100 receiving yards, scored himself multiple touchdowns, and going forward should be one of the primary options of this offense, considering the fact that he played the most offensive snaps amongst all wide receivers on the Texans in week 9. On top of the fact that he had a career high 11 targets, the momentum continues in the direction of Tank Dell. Going forward, this is a pass-first offense without a running game. These receivers continue to vie for value every single week. The second option I wanted to mention is Quentin Johnston. He plays later tonight. If you're able to potentially pick him up before tonight's game, it would be extremely advantageous because we did get word earlier today that Joshua Palmer is being sent to the injured reserve. With that being the case, Quentin Johnston absolutely is guaranteed the number 2 receiving role within this offense. After guys like Keenan Allen and Austin Eckler get their receptions, of course it is going to be Quentin Johnston as he kind of is thrown into the fire tonight against the New York Jets. I'm not expecting much out of him, but there is a potential in which going forward, he absolutely could take advantage of this role as the number 2 receiving option as a wide receiver of the Los Angeles Chargers, associated with such a great quarterback like Justin Herbert. Moving on to the number 3 option, I wanted to mention Demario Douglas once again, currently rostered in 35% of Yahoo leagues, 45% of sleeper leagues. He takes on Indianapolis in Germany this upcoming week. He did lead the entire wide receiver position for the Patriots in terms of overall snaps. He had himself a safe game. For full PPR purposes, I think for the remainder of the season, without scoring a touchdown, he is a safe 10 points every single week. Will probably be able to get himself 4 to 6 receptions per game, 40 to 60 receiving yards per game on a consistent basis. Now, if in fact he is given red zone opportunities, of course, he'll be able to flourish beyond that. But as of right now, just a safe overall play in a half and full PPR scoring format. Now, those top 3 players, Tank Dell, Quentin Johnston, and Demario Douglas, I mentioned on multiple occasions already over the course of this season. So under the assumption they are already rostered, the other players that potentially are available are guys like Zay Jones, Wan'Dale Robinson, or Odell Beckham Jr. that could be of value. All 3 of these wide receivers are rostered in about 20% of leagues as of this current moment in time. Zay Jones, again, he has been injured for majority of the season, but in the 2 games in which we have seen him play healthy, he has scored a touchdown in each of those games. So the expectation is returning to this lineup. They take on the San Francisco 49ers coming off of the bye week. If he is healthy against that defense and that secondary that has been very much so unstable as of late, could be of value. Wan'Dale Robinson, the quarterback conversation in regards to the Giants is a complete mess. Daniel Jones, unfortunately, season-ending ACL injury. We know that there is a potential in which Tyrod Taylor may be sent to the injured reserve. DeVito in the last couple weeks has been completely lost at the quarterback position. At least was able to throw a couple times in the direction of Wan'Dale Robinson, who scored the lone touchdown for the Giants yesterday. But Matt Barkley is expected to most likely be the starting quarterback for this week and maybe going forward. We'll have to keep an eye on that, but Wan'Dale Robinson has value. The last player is Odell Beckham Jr. that I wanted to mention. In the last 2 games in which he hasn't left the game due to an injury, again, just a reminder, in week 8, left the game due to an injury. He did return, but wasn't the same, wasn't able to even have a single reception within that overall contest. But in the last couple games in which he's been fully healthy, seen a pretty ample volume of targets. But the thing about Baltimore Ravens wide receivers is like they're identical to Kansas City Chiefs wide receivers. You can't really trust one of them. Like, we want to trust Rashee Rice and we want to trust Zay Flowers, but outside of those 2 guys, everything else is kind of complementary and is going to be inconsistent at times. So just be very careful with it. Again, like I mentioned, the wide receiver position relatively thin. Let's move on to the tight end and quarterback conversation, beginning with our number 1, Jonnu Smith. I still don't understand how Jonnu Smith is currently only rostered in 28% of Yahoo leagues and 31% of sleeper leagues. I understand that he has had himself inconsistencies and he is just purely of value only in point per reception formats. But yesterday's performance of 6 targets, 5 catches, 100 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown, 18.5 fantasy points. If he's going to continue to see a higher volume of overall targets and receptions than Kyle Pitts, even with a change at quarterback, the assumption is, of course, Jonnu Smith should be on roster going forward as Taylor Heinicke continued to look in his direction, and he was a huge part of that offense, especially late in the game, in order to try to potentially capture a victory. The other option I wanted to mention is Cade Otton. Cade Otton in the last 3 games has had a 3 consecutive game streak of 6 or more targets. Obviously had himself far more red zone opportunities, which is why he scored 2 touchdowns. But typically, within the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense, we have seen that the red zone threats have been Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. Yet, on Sunday's game against the Houston Texans, a high-scoring game at that, we did see a lot of Cade Otton and Rachaad White opportunities down in the red zone, which obviously led to both of them scoring 2 overall touchdowns. We'll keep an eye on that going forward. Currently only rostered in 5% of Yahoo leagues, 10% of sleeper leagues. Could be an option for those of you who are in need of a tight end, considering the recent injury that took place to Dallas Goedert. Moving on to the final option I wanted to mention, another one of these players that is currently only rostered in 10% of leagues. It is Juwan Johnson. Over the course of Juwan Johnson's career, Johnson has consistently found himself in the end zone. And even with Taysom Hill having himself a receiving touchdown on Sunday, we still saw Juwan Johnson, amongst all tight ends on the New Orleans Saints, lead the overall position in terms of overall snaps, played 75% of the offensive snaps. And going forward, as long as his offense continues to play as well as they have over the course of the last 2 games, my expectation is that Juwan Johnson certainly will have value for fantasy purposes as a tight end option going forward. Let's talk about a couple quarterbacks. First and foremost, let's talk about Joshua Dobbs. Absolutely ridiculous what he was able to accomplish on Sunday. Many of us already had him rostered and probably kept him in case going forward he was going to be of value with the Minnesota Vikings. That was kind of the expectation considering what was going to surround him within that organization. But considering he was able to come in after Jaren Hall sustained a concussion and lead this team to a victory is unbelievable. We know that in college, this guy was an aerospace engineer. He is an absolute genius. And regardless of the fact that he had no reps at practice with the Minnesota Vikings starting team, he still showed up and balled out and led this team to a victory. This upcoming week, they take on the New Orleans Saints, and with a full week of practice potentially under his belt, Josh Dobbs absolutely will be a fantastic quarterback option, on top of the fact that he has himself rushing upside every single week. Speaking of rushing upside, Taylor Heinicke was able to go over his overall underdog number of, I think it was 13.5 rushing yards. He had 20 rushing yards. He consistently does that in his career. He continues to find himself a lot of success in the running game because he is capable of doing so. Overall, his performance was fine. I mean, I thought he had a solid game. In terms of the overall conversation of quarterback, he's not going to have these extremely high upside games, but hopefully going forward with Drake London potentially returning from the groin injury, there is an expectation that going against the Arizona Cardinals should be an easier matchup within the given week. Taylor Heinicke could be a pretty solid spot start for those of you who are potentially missing guys like Matthew Stafford, Tua Tagovailoa, Jalen Hurts, or Patrick Mahomes going into the week. The final player I wanted to mention is Mac Jones. Mac Jones, currently only rostered in 13 to 17% of leagues, takes on Indianapolis in Germany. He has been solid in the last couple games. The matchup against Indianapolis is an advantageous one. Maybe he could step up to the task on hand and play well in Germany. Let's move on to special teams, defenses, and kickers. Let's talk about the kicker conversation, beginning with Nick Folk. First and foremost, he is currently only rostered in 19% of Yahoo, 14% of Sleeper. Nick Folk has been able to score 10 plus fantasy points in 6 of his 8 games this season. He has already passed his bye week, a solid option. Talk about Brandon McManus. The Jacksonville Jaguars are coming off of their bye week, and he is currently only rostered in 20% of Yahoo leagues, 28% of sleeper leagues. He's been able to accomplish 8 plus fantasy points in 6 of the last 8 games he has played, and he's most recently coming off of performances of 14, 17, and 16 fantasy points. Of course, a lot of field goals being scored within that overall organization, and a lot of them for 50 plus yards, which of course, for those of you who play in a league in which you get 5 plus fantasy points for a 50-yard field goal, keep that in mind. The final player I wanted to mention at the kicker position is Greg Joseph. Going forward without Kirk Cousins, I'm assuming this offense will not be as proficient down in the red zone. They may stall out more, and if that's going to be the case, that'll lead to more overall field goals from Greg Joseph. But as of late, considering the winning streak this team has been on, Greg Joseph has been fantastic for fantasy purposes. Currently only rostered in 10% of leagues. He's been able to put up 9+ fantasy points in 4 out of the last 5 games. I think he's in a perfect spot, even though he has a week 13 bye. Until then, should be a solid overall starter at the kicker position. Let's move on to a couple defenses that you can stream. The one that I'm thinking of streaming this week is the Chicago Bears. For another consecutive game, they've been able to stop the run. They take on the Carolina Panthers this week. The Carolina Panthers have given up a lot of fantasy points to defenses that have taken them on. A lot of turnovers on a consistent basis. Of course, through 2 pick sixes yesterday against Kenny Moore, the expectation is that the Chicago Bears defense could be of value. The Jacksonville Jaguars coming off of the bye week, currently only rostered in 20% of leagues. There is a potential in which somebody dropped them. I know that they take on the San Francisco 49ers this upcoming week, but going forward for the remainder of the season, this has been a great overall defense for fantasy purposes. The final defense I wanted to mention are the Cincinnati Bengals. They take on the Houston Texans. This defense has played extremely well against a lot of teams. As of late, they really haven't given up very many points, and I understand that CJ Stroud is coming off of a legendary performance of 470 passing yards, 5 passing touchdowns. Unbelievable number. The fantasy gods have blessed our hidden gems, but going into this week, the expectation is that the Cincinnati Bengals defense could give them a lot of trouble. Okay, with that all covered, let's transition into talking about the rest of season strength of schedule at all 4 primary positions, beginning with running back, shall we? If you guys have gotten this far in the video, do me a favor, click the like button down below. Subscribe if you haven't yet already, because again, we're making daily fantasy football content, and I'm trying to present as much valuable and applicable information as possible to help lead you to a 2023 fantasy football championship. Thank you very much for the support. Okay, so as you guys can see, we have running backs weeks 10 through 17 strength of schedule. The number 1 ranked team are the New England Patriots, which means in terms of their rest of season strength of schedule, in terms of running back rushing statistics allowed by defenses over the course of the season thus far this season, which currently doesn't include tonight's game between the Los Angeles Chargers and Jets. But again, that's not going to shift it very much. We find that the New England Patriots, Pittsburgh Steelers, Philadelphia Eagles, Dallas Cowboys, for the remainder of the fantasy football season, weeks 10 through 17, have the most advantageous strength of schedule going forward. Now, when we go ahead and we purely isolate weeks 10 through 14, for those of you who are struggling and really need to make a final push to get to the fantasy football playoffs in the next 5 games, potentially, this should give you a little bit more information as to who you should be targeting potentially in an upcoming trade, as the Patriots, Cowboys, Commanders, Minnesota Vikings, Tampa Bay Buccaneers are at the top of this overall conversation. We know that Tony Pollard has been struggling as of late, and even though, Ramondre Stevenson had himself that huge run in yesterday's game for a rushing touchdown, still only had single-digit rushing attempts, there is still a possibility in which you could potentially bring these guys in to bring you value. Obviously, pause this overall screen if you guys are looking to try to dissect this overall information, but I want to go ahead and continue on in terms of talking about weeks 15 through 17, the fantasy football playoff strength of schedule. As you guys can see, for those of you who are prepping for the fantasy football playoffs, of course, like I mentioned in the preseason, Derrick Henry gets to play against the Houston Texans, the Seattle Seahawks, and the Houston Texans. Those are the 3 weeks throughout the fantasy football playoffs. He's played extremely well as of late. He's a guy that, of course, is going to have value. But the fact that the Philadelphia Eagles, DeAndre Swift, is in this conversation, fantastic. Unfortunately, the last couple weeks, a lot of touchdowns stolen from Kenneth Gainwell. It is what it is. But, of course, another offensive option like Austin Eckler, Bijan Robinson, Najee Harris, who sure hasn't had a great season to begin with, but as of late has gained a little bit of momentum here. There are some options there that could be of value going into the final games of the season. Keep that in mind. All right, let's move on to the wide receiver conversation, weeks 10 through 17. Of course, the number 1 team that has the easiest strength of schedule at the wide receiver position for the remainder of the season is the San Francisco 49ers, which in comparison to the Miami Dolphins, the Miami Dolphins, there is an 11-point difference there, nearly, which is a ridiculous number. Now, even though that is the case, we do expect that Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle will have themselves successful performances, and hopefully it won't be as bleak as Sunday's game in Germany for those 2 options. But going forward, the expectation is you want to look at some of these top options: San Francisco, the Dallas Cowboys, Green Bay. Again, you can't really trust their quarterback, so that is tough. But the Indianapolis Colts, Michael Pittman Jr. is playing extremely well. Josh Downs, I know he left yesterday's game due to an injury. If and when he gets healthy, could be evaluated later on in the year. But when we go ahead and we isolate weeks 10 through 14, for those of you who are trying to make the fantasy football playoffs, we have the following. Again, still at the top of the conversation, many of these teams, while on the bottom of the conversation, we have the Philadelphia Eagles, receiving threats, the New York Jets receiving threats, Washington Commanders, etc. When we go ahead and isolate weeks 15 through 17, the fantasy football playoffs, the Seattle Seahawks wide receivers, the Arizona Cardinals wide receivers, and Baltimore Ravens. That was nothing, I was expecting to see. Even Denver Broncos, Green Bay Packers. These are typically not teams that you want to, potentially rely upon, especially considering how inconsistent guys like DK Metcalf has been this season. Hopefully, with the return of Kyler Murray at the number 2 spot, the Arizona Cardinals, Marquise Hollywood Brown, Michael Wilson could be a value. The Baltimore Ravens receiving options, of course, we're going to lean upon Zay Flowers first and foremost, but the second option there, OBJ, like we mentioned earlier on in today's episode in terms of waiver wire potential pickups. Moving on, let's talk about the tight end position for the remainder of the season. For the remainder of the season, we are going to have most likely Dallas Goedert on the injured reserve. So keep in mind, for those of you who are looking for a tight end, the guys that I mentioned earlier in regards to Jonnu Smith, Cade Otton, potentially Juwan Johnson, if guys like Luke Musgrave or potentially Hunter Henry are available, they could be of value. But ultimately, Minnesota Vikings, guys like TJ Hawkinson, Sam Laporta in the Lions, David Njoku in the Browns, Trey McBride in the Arizona Cardinals. These are great options for the remainder of the season in terms of strength of schedule going forward. When we isolate the regular season, for those of you trying to make a playoff push, of course, the overall tight ends that we love to see at the top of this conversation, both guys that had incredible games. Dalton Kincaid, 10 catches for over 80 receiving yards. If it wasn't for the fumble, would have had an even better game. But of course, Dalton Schultz had a monster game on Sunday. Going forward, taking on Cincinnati this week, he should continue his overall momentum in that overall capacity. But when we continue on and talk about weeks 15 through 17 to capture a fantasy football championship, at the top of this conversation, still a lot of these teams, Njoku, Laporta, Hawkinson, Pat Freiermuth potentially returning if and when he is healthy, coming off of his second IR stint of the season, could be a value in the late half of the year. Or, of course, the Dallas Cowboys tight end who has had himself 2 consecutive monster games, Jake Ferguson, within that overall conversation. Moving on to weeks 10 through 17 at the quarterback position in terms of strength of schedule. Brock Purdy, Jared Goff, Kyler Murray, Josh Allen, Dak Prescott. They're at the top of this conversation. They have the easiest strength of schedule in comparison to the other half. Now, the separation of value, when we talk about strength of schedule in terms of quarterback passing statistics allowed, isn't that much of a difference from the number 1 team to the number 32 team in comparison to what we saw from the wide receiver conversation. But just keep in mind, some of these quarterbacks have a little bit more advantageous matchups, but these numbers also don't include the potential rushing upside that these quarterbacks have. Now let's talk about weeks 10 through 14. Of course, the San Francisco 49ers, and of course, the Detroit Lions still at the top of this conversation. Moving on, let's talk about the fantasy football playoffs. Which quarterbacks do we want to have on roster? Kyler Murray has the easiest strength of schedule throughout the fantasy football playoffs, but that is on passing statistics alone. Where Kyler Murray has purely succeeded throughout his career is rushing statistics. If he can be mobile, even coming off of the ACL, by all means, Kyler Murray could absolutely be a fantasy threat to close out the year and potentially capture us a fantasy football championship. Keep that in mind. All right. Now that we've covered all this, we're going to go ahead and put together a couple pick'em slips via Underdog Fantasy to close out today's episode. So let's go ahead and check that out right now. So as of late, I've been on a little bit of a hot streak. Going back to Thursday's game between the Pittsburgh Steelers and, of course, Tennessee Titans, both those overall plays hit. We move on to Saturday's overall play throughout our live stream. I think Ube came into the chat and said, hey, Dorian Finney-Smith, just check him out. I don't know which stat. He said something about 3-point shots or rebounds. I went ahead and I rolled with the overall points, considering he was able to do that on a consistent basis. And of course, they had LeBron James on a overall bonus play available to everyone. We took advantage of that. Also on Saturday's stream, while I was putting together these overall plays, I was like, guys, we expect Aaron Jones to have himself a massive game. The coaching staff have told us that he is going to. Demario Douglas is expected to be a huge role within this offense, was able to clear his overall number. But unfortunately, the only play that wasn't able to hit was Adam Thielen. Dalton Kincaid hit from our Hidden Gems episode suggestion. So did Kyle Pitts. But Adam Thielen, the guy that on 5 consecutive games was able to surpass 69.5 receiving yards, 70 plus in 5 consecutive games, unfortunately did not show up. Hopefully that's not going to be a repeated thing for Adam Thielen, as he is a huge fantasy kind of prospect for many of us. He's a top 12 option at the wide receiver position going forward, hopefully. But as of right now, for sure did have himself a disappointing performance. But as you guys can see, the only leg that hadn't already, gone through is tonight's game, Garrett Wilson. But speaking of, I want to go ahead and suggest Garrett Wilson along with another player in regards to tonight's game between the Jets and Los Angeles Chargers. My favorite play going into tonight's game is Garrett Wilson at 66.5 receiving yards. I was able to get him on Friday at 65.5 receiving yards. Doesn't really matter. One yard difference could be the hook, but I don't expect that to be the biggest difference maker there. The fact of the matter is, Garrett Wilson in 3 of the last 4 games has seen 12 or more targets. He's been able to get himself, 100 receiving yards and 90 receiving yards the last 2 games he has played. And then on the other half of that conversation, we talk about Austin Eckler, who again is going to have to be a huge receiving option in this offense without Josh Palmer there. And of course, most likely Quentin Johnston and Keenan Allen both having a tough time throughout the game. Justin Herbert is not a quarterback that throughout his career has demonstrated that he wants to throw the ball into tight windows and make some risky plays. He always wants to make the safe play, and tonight it's going to be the check down going in the direction of Austin Eckler. So those are the two plays that I would suggest going into tonight. There are a lot of plays available, whether it's the NFL, the NBA, etc., college football, you can take advantage of via Underdog Fantasy, but these are the two that I'm rolling with. If in fact you want to go ahead and take advantage of the play of signing up today using code Andrew and making that first time deposit minimum of $10 once, not only will you get the 0.5 total yard play of Justin Herbert that you can add to this overall slip, but you can also go ahead and make another slip or so going into tonight's game. Thank you everybody for watching. Enjoy tonight's game. I'll be back tomorrow with some running back rankings. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.